Hi everyone, hey Sam Gather, and everybody out in YouTube land that's going to join us later. Well, hey, happy Memorial Day, everybody. For those of us if you work in the public sector, one of the things it means it's a day off, so we have off tomorrow, so that's always good. Yay! It gives us a little bit of time. And also, it is the unofficial start to summer, so I decided to wear my most recent Hawaiian shirt that I got in Hawaii over spring break. So we're bringing the summer. Summer's great, right? It's that time where we go, at least mentally perhaps. I'm in teaching, so it is a period of rest for those of us in that field. But it is also the time where people take vacations and rest and relax and reflect on their lives. So the title of my speech today was inspired by the fact that it is Memorial Day, and it sounds a little bit perhaps paradoxical, because the title of my speech is Freedom of Speech is Not Freedom. So I'm going to explore these ideas a little bit. First, I want to give a little bit of history about Memorial Day. So Memorial Day actually did not become a national holiday until Congress passed a law in 1968. But in fact, what happened is that during the Civil War, folks started visiting the graves of their loved ones because that war was so bloody. We lost about 2% of our population at that time, which means today, if we had a war today, that we would, if we had a war like the Civil War today, 11 million people would die. So that's the extent of what the Civil War started. So what people used to do is they used to go to visit the grave sites of those who had died in the war and decorate them. It was actually first called Decoration Days, with flowers and mementos and so on and so forth. But Memorial Day, what you often hear is when we commemorate our nation's wars, what we often hear is that those folks died for freedom. And I don't necessarily agree with that completely. I think it's a little bit different, and I think we need to explore that topic a little bit differently. Now, this is the first thing I want to say. First of all, I want to read the First Amendment. Here is the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Now, some of you may know your history around this, but this was actually, the first 10 amendments are basically put in the Constitution of our United States to protect individual liberties and freedoms. It wasn't part of the original U.S. Constitution document. It actually came out as a compromise. But it was profound in human history to have the First Amendment be placed in a document. It was the first time in human history that actually these freedoms had been written down, at least in modern human history. Although there had been precedent in England through various informal customs or common law at the time. So we have these freedoms that are essentially expressed. I also want to say that without the First Amendment, the book that we study quite possibly could not have been channeled and published. One of the reasons why, as you know, one of the reasons that historically you look at and see what happened to Jesus when he went out and preached is that his teachings were perceived to be a threat to the established order. You can also say the established order is the ego, right? The ego always seeks control. So the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin and the Romans were convinced by the Sanhedrin that Jesus' teachings were actually a threat to the rule of order, to their rule. And so that's essentially what happened in terms of trumping up the charges against him. But what was perceived in the 1960s is that we as humanity were able to accept this teaching of A Course in Miracles. And because of the First Amendment, where it said we had freedom of religion, we were actually, the book could come through and essentially be protected. So that's a good thing. And at that time, that's a good thing about, the United States and our democracy. However, we are often, just like in our lives when we study the Course in Miracles, we're supposed to take, I think, a factual account of what's going on. And if you look at the state of our freedoms in this country, and perhaps our democracy, there are some there is some challenging issues. And so I did some research on this. There is actually an organization that for 20 or 30 years now has been doing an assessment of the democracies around the world, and they rank them from 1 to 167. All the nations, okay? And the organization is out of the United Kingdom. It's called the Economics Intelligence Unit, and you can research this on Wikipedia. They publish it each year. And they basically rank democracies across the world, okay? And currently, the United States is ranked 21st. They rank according to 5 areas. Pluralism, which is basically how well all the different groups in the society actively participate in the democracy. Civil liberties, political culture, political participation, and the functioning of government. Now, so they do these 5 different ratings, and we are seen now as lacking. The reason why we're 21st is that we're lacking in civil liberties, political participation, and the functioning of our government, meaning how well it meets the needs and aspirations of the government. Now, who are the top? Well, let me tell you the top 5. The top 5 are number 1, Norway, number 2, Iceland, number 3, Sweden, 4, New Zealand, and 5, Denmark. So if you notice, basically 4 out of the 5 Nordic states. Iceland is not Nordic, but it is, a lot of the people came from the Scandinavian countries, I should say. So they're number 1. And in fact, they list different countries by their status, and they give them a rating. And the first 19 countries are considered full democracies. Number 21, we are now considered a flawed democracy. Oh no. Okay. Now, so let's look at that. All right. Is this actually true? So get this. In the biggest election that we have, which is the presidential election, here are the percentages of people that voted. In 2000, 50% of the people eligible to vote voted. In 2004, 55%. In 2008, 58%. 2012, 59%. And 2016, 55%. Now, let me give you a number. Here's a number. In 2016, 112 million people that were eligible to vote did not cast a ballot in our presidential election. Okay? So, it's kind of very interesting. So, what I'm saying here is that we are a country that proposes to be this democracy. And we believe that because we have freedom of speech, that we are actually free. But are we really? Now, what are some of the, just taking a look at this, what are some of the ideas, or what are things that are happening around that may be impacting this? This is what I've researched. Besides political participation, which as we see is very low, there are voter suppression laws. We actually have states in this country that make it more difficult for minority groups to vote. Just look it up on the internet. There used to be a doctrine in the United States, a law that was called the Fairness Doctrine, that was repealed in 1987. Now get this. What this said is that for any controversial issue, broadcast networks, anybody that broadcasts, that includes, if you look at the TV stations today, anyone that issues on anybody that would cover a controversial issue, that if you showed one side of the argument, you had to give equal time to the other side of the argument. That was just done away with in 1987 because they said, it wasn't working. They said it wasn't working. Now get this. They did a study of the 2016 presidential election, President Trump earned $5.6 billion of free media. Under the Fairness Doctrine, that meant that whoever he was running against should have gotten equal time. Now, Hillary Clinton did earn also free media, but at nowhere near the extent of what he received. There was a recent study done by Professor Martin Gillens of Princeton and Benjamin Page of Northwestern University, and I talked about this in one of my previous talks. And it says, does government represent the people? And this is what they found. The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero statistically, non-significant impact on public policy. They found that 90% of the laws passed by Congress benefit the wealthy, corporations, or highly funded special interest groups. That, like maybe the NRA could be considered a finely. More disturbingly, 52% of Americans see Congress as corrupt. 79% see Congress as out of touch, and that's from the Pew Charitable Research Organization, which does a lot of these things. Okay, so now we can all go and commit suicide. I only kid you. Now, so as we know, in just like the ego, right? The ego loves this. The ego loves to have differences. And if you take a look at our current political culture, and even our current media, what we see is this dynamic of blue states and red states, or blue voters and red voters. And no matter what side you're on, the ego loves this. And in fact, although I would be identified more with the blue person, or a blue voter, I guess you'd say, from a blue state, certainly California is a blue state, I have really stopped watching news media outlets that are very, very biased. So for example, MSNBC, which I used to watch before the 2016 election, I've become disenchanted with. And the reason is not only because it is basically become an anti-Trump network and is always almost like 99% talking about this Russian collusion thing, but when you think about it, it's not talking about the deeper underlying issues that impact most of us today. Like most of us are concerned about quality of life, being able to have a job that allows us to support ourselves, being able to have a public education system that actually works. Now, I'm a teacher in the public education system, and in fact, the system doesn't work. And we have models of systems throughout the world that do work, and part of the reason is because we choose, I have to say, we choose not to work. We choose not to provide the resources for public education. Our healthcare system, we spend more money per person than any healthcare system in the world, and yet it doesn't work. So what we have to challenge then, for all of us, is this notion that because there is the appearance of freedom of speech, that it's going to result in a healthy democracy. And in fact, it does not. The ego still has its way. Now, as we know, one of the things that the Course teaches us, one of the lessons is a happy outcome to all things is sure. And I still have a lot of hope about having freedom in our society and being able to have it reflected in our government. And here's my hope. I'm seeing many little things happening that are going against what is kind of the prevailing culture in our society. The prevailing culture seems to be that we become like an oligarchy, where the rule of the few and the wealthy have a more determinant role than the consent of the people, that most people's needs are being ignored. But going back to 2008, we see the Occupy movement, where people, professionals, financial professionals, and people of all stripes and sizes started to occupy near Wall Street, a park, saying, hey, something's going wrong here. And when people begin to do this, when people begin to just stand up and say, hey, this isn't okay, We're seeing it with the Me Too movement now, where yes, there may be, excuse me, there may be some excesses to it, but women and men and anybody who has been harassed or discriminated against are standing up to the powerful and saying this isn't okay. It's scary because, as we know in the ego world, where we have different power dynamics, people are afraid because they could get harmed to their person, their job, their career, and so on and so forth. But people are doing it. Since I'm a teacher, I'm aware of these things. There have been wildcat strikes throughout the red states in West Virginia, in Kentucky, in Oklahoma, and Arizona. In other words, teachers have just said enough is enough. They don't have enough textbooks in the classes, they're way underpaid, they have to work 2 jobs, and they're just standing up and they're saying no. I see it with nurses. Nurses have gone on strike. Nurses are saying we're working too many hours, it's unsafe for the patients. So we're starting to see the seeds of, I think, grassroots democracy at work. So even though it appears that our democracy is flawed at this point, just like we sometimes appear to be, we do have the seeds of hope coming up from that. Now, when I said freedom of speech does not mean freedom, it's true. Even in a political sense. And why is that? Well, it has to do with responsibility. And it's the same thing as A Course in Miracles. Now, no matter how free our political systems may be, that doesn't mean that we're going to be free in a spiritual sense. This comes from the Course in Miracles. God's promises makes no exceptions, and He guarantees that only joy can be the final outcome for everything. Here's the key part. Yet it is up to us when this is reached, how long we let an alien will appear to be opposing His. How long we allow an alien will to be opposing His. So even if we achieve the ideal political democracy that any of us may choose, if we are perceiving those who disagree with us in judgment, condemning, or criticizing them, we are not free. If we are attacking them, as opposed to in the reading today that was read, siding with freedom, then we are not free. So we may appear to in our lives be fighting for what we believe to be right and just. And maybe we can all agree on that there are many causes that we could be fighting for to end misogyny, to end racism, to end various forms of gender inequity or homophobia. But if we are attacking those who disagree with us, then we are not free. This comes from the Course. He gives no power to sin, and I would put a parenthesis separation, and therefore it has none. Its results, a world sees them, sickness. So we see sickness and death and misery and pain. So what we ultimately come down to is, we come down to this. If we choose freedom, we will experience only its results. In the Course in Miracles, excuse me. In the Course in Miracles, freedom comes from the power to choose with God's will. I want to give you a story, an example. So recently, I was in school. There was a student that I work with who created an anti-Semitic picture. It drew a Jewish person in a very ugly manner. And the picture was in the student's desk, but the teacher, because of another concern, searched, how to go in the student's desk and found this picture. So there was a meeting that took place with the principal and the parent and so on and so forth. Now, this student was arguing that this was freedom of speech, that they should have a right to draw and depict images. Now, the student we weren't there to suspend the student or do anything, because in a school setting, unless someone is offended, meaning another student is offended, no action can be really taken. But we wanted to talk to the student because our perception was that this drawing was actually not free speech, but hate speech. And hate speech, according to law, is not protected. Now, his argument was that it wasn't hate speech, it was a joke between him and his friends, but that it should still be protected under freedom of speech. Okay? So some of us still have this, so there is this argument that we really are trying to protect freedom of speech as much as we can because we believe it is one of the foundations of democracy. But we have decided that there are limits to it. And we try not to limit political speech, but we do place limits on dangerous speech and hate speech. So you can't go into a movie theater and yell fire, right? That's not free speech. That's putting people in danger and harm. So you have to be careful about that. So we were trying to make this arguments with this person, this student, and so on and so forth. We weren't getting there. But what I felt was, from a course perspective, we were trying to make sure that we were listening to him, that we weren't judging him, and that we're trying to come to some level of understanding with him. And, because people are going to have offensive views to us, and that could actually result in us having this. So what I have to say is that, as we go about our path in life, whether it's political freedom that we're searching for, or what I think is a deeper freedom, which is a freedom from the ego, the freedom from sin, the freedom from misery, the freedom from guilt and anxiety and worry, we can make choices. We're only responsible for the choices that we make. And so it's how we respond. And so we will have true freedom when we choose to side with Spirit and with God. And that's my talk for today.
Thank you.